Hi, everyone. Again, I am Solana Rice, co founder and co executive director of Liberation in a Generation, and welcome to Guarantees for a Good Life income, housing, jobs, and family care. Thank you for joining for what is surely going to be a lit panel because my friends and colleagues are fabulous. So I am pleased to have this conversation with you all because at Liberation in a Generation, we believe that we need bold, transformative policies to ensure that Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, all people of color no longer live in an oppression economy. You all may know that if we do nothing today, Black and Latinx wealth will be zero by the middle of this century. And that is absolutely going to be hardened and steadfast with this pandemic. That reality is largely driven by the fact that our economy thrives from theft, exclusion, and exploitation of people of color. This is an economy where racism fuels profit, and we're ready to usher in a liberation economy where all people of color belong and thrive. We think this liberation economy should be undergirded by a set of basic economic rights, which we're going to explore with you all today. While we are focused on guaranteed housing, family care, jobs, and income today, we know that healthcare, debt-free college, generational wealth, clean air, and drinking water, these should all definitely be included on this list of guarantees, right? So we encourage you to put your thoughts on guarantees in the chat, throw your questions in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring. This is a short conversation. We're trying to pack a lot in, so we might not get to all your questions, but we appreciate them. You know, we have, as a nation, we have major decisions to make about the direction of this economy. And I'm grateful to have the talents and brilliance of Tara Raghuveer, Mia Birdsong, Sarah Truhaft, and Jess Morales Roqueto in this fight. And so for the sake of time, you should just check out their bios online. I'm not going to go into all their accolades. We're going to dive right into conversation. So thank you all for being with us today. I'm going to start out with a question about why a set, what are the things, what is the national guarantee that you are looking to advance, and why is it important? An important part of solving a critical issue for people of color. And let's start with you, Tara Raghuveer. You're with People's Action and KC Tenants. You all have been focusing on a homes guarantee. Tell us more.
Thanks, Alana, and thanks so much to my co-panelists. This is an awesome lineup, and I'm excited to be in conversation with you all. My name is Tara, and I'm the Homes Guarantee Campaign Director at People's Action. I'm also the founder and director of a grassroots organization of radical tenants in Kansas City, Missouri called KC Tenants. And the Homes Guarantee is a campaign with a relatively simple premise. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We can and we must guarantee that everyone has a home. Full stop, period. So it's a simple premise, but it's one that's complicated by a conspiracy of the profiteers that has stifled our imagination, leaving us to believe that housing is a commodity and not a human right, and that it must be delivered by the private market. The Homes Guarantee is a campaign that aims to transform this notion and transform the reality from housing being treated as a commodity to housing being guaranteed as a public good and as a human right once and for all. And of course, right now, our country falls woefully short of delivering on this vision. I want to ground us by sharing the stories of a couple of the leaders who have shaped the vision of the Homes Guarantee from the beginning. One leader is one of my favorite, a fierce leader from Kansas City named Tiana Caldwell, who's the descendant of slaves. She's the granddaughter and the daughter of veterans who did not benefit from the GI Bill. She grew up in poverty in Parsons, Kansas. Tiana was diagnosed with ovarian cancer last spring and forced to choose between paying for her cancer treatments or keeping a roof over her head. And ultimately, her landlord evicted her. Her family became homeless, and she ended up spending $300 to $500 a week to live in a hotel for 6 months. Vernell Robinson is another fierce leader from New York, a public housing resident in Far Rockaway, Queens. Vernell survived Superstorm Sandy, only to experience undrinkable water and mold and her housing falling apart in the city's already crumbling public housing stock. Jermaine Abdullah got out of prison. He lived in homeless shelters for 3 years, and he reported to us that the shelters were filthy, the roofs leaked, roaches crawled on the sinks and toilet seats, and to Jermaine, the shelter felt like prison all over again. Now, of course, unfortunately, these stories are not isolated or extreme, but they're actually very typical outcomes of America's systemic and racialized housing emergency. And I'm sure many of my co-panelists will reflect this on their issues as well. America's land and housing policies since the earliest days of this settler state have been built on theft, extraction, and exclusion. And our housing policies, of course, are currently designed for profits and not for people. Just a couple of quick stats here. In 2020, a full-time worker earning minimum wage cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any American county, urban, suburban, or rural. 12 million households, disproportionately, of course, Black and brown households, spend over half their income on the rent, America has betrayed its public housing residents and communities through decades of racist neglect. And of course, millions of people experience homelessness or live one emergency away from it. This is not a story of a functioning private market. This is a story of vast and brutal market failure. And this failure is all the more pronounced now under the context of a raging pandemic where millions of people have lost employment and therefore their housing has been all the more threatened during a time when housing was the prescription. We were told that in order to keep ourselves safe and healthy and our neighbors safe and healthy, we were to stay home. But for so many people, that was never an option, and now it's even less so. In my hometown, Kansas City, where I organize, people are now being evicted by conference call, and of course in the courts as well. And every time this happens, what we are saying as a society is that we think that landlords' profits are more important than people's lives, and that's not right. So we have a vision for a better world, one in which housing is guaranteed as a public good. This vision came from people like Tiana, Vernell, David, and Jermaine, who are experts of their own liberation. And what we are calling for is a massive, a totally unprecedented federal investment in guaranteeing housing for everyone by building millions of units of social housing, eradicating homelessness, investing in the public housing that still exists, protecting renters, paying reparations for centuries of racist land and housing policies, and an end to real estate and land speculation once and for all. And our vision is that fully realized, this will guarantee that everyone has a home, of course, and it will guarantee that people are coming before profit. We don't see this as a radical idea. We see it as an economic, political, and moral necessity. And I'll stop there for now. Thanks, Alana.
Thank you, Tara. So inspired by that vision. And, housing is such a critical part of our stability, just general stability, not only economic stability, but just our livelihood. And so we're going to talk to Sarah Truhaft with PolicyLink about a jobs guarantee.
Thank you so much. I'm Sarah Truhaft, as Alana said, Vice President of Research at PolicyLink, and we are happy to be signed on to the Homes Guarantee and working for that. But right now I'm going to talk about our work on a job guarantee. And what I mean by that is a public option for a job for every person who wants one. These jobs would be publicly financed, public jobs, and you would have a right to a job. And a few things about these jobs: it would not be just any job, but a good job. So a key part of a job guarantee is that these are living wage jobs, or at least non-poverty jobs, with full benefits, regular full-time hours, and full worker rights. And the jobs would be on projects that are addressing long neglected community needs. Projects that benefit communities like environmental remediation, childcare and elder care, helping out in public schools, public art, things that we need in our communities that are demanded in communities, especially communities that have been distressed and exploited. but are not provided by the market. We could provide those with a job guarantee. And critically, it would dramatically increase worker power by providing this alternative of a good job to workers who are being harassed, who are not being paid. They would be able to say no, and that would force employers to raise the floor in order to keep employees. So just some of the foundations of a job guarantee and how it would benefit people of color and address, it would address longstanding racial inequities in terms of employment and income, which then lead to the racial wealth gap, although we know we need separate strategies for that. But we know that when it comes to employment, that people of color face higher unemployment at all times, especially Black workers, but other workers of color too, for Native American, Pacific Islander, other Asian subgroups. And for example, Black workers with some college have the same unemployment rates in most communities as white workers with no high school diploma. So we see these extreme inequities and differences. You can see it for your community in the National Equity Atlas. And this is economic violence. It is due to discrimination, which research has shown has not gotten any better in 25 years. And also racist policies like mass incarceration, which have really locked people out of jobs and economic opportunity. So, and it's also about the income gap because people of color have less access to good jobs that are paying a living wage. So we know 40% of workers earn less than $15 an hour, and it's disproportionately Black, Latinx workers in those jobs that are not good jobs to sustain a family. This is why these benefits around racial equity is why a job guarantee was really a core component of the civil rights demands. Sadie Alexander, the first economist, first Black economist, called for a job guarantee to address these structural inequities in our labor market. And then that demand was picked up by Martin Luther King when he calling for guaranteed jobs and guaranteed income. And then Coretta Scott King, after Martin Luther King was murdered, carried that mantle forward and advocated for a job guarantee. So it's really the most transformative economic policy we could implement in our toolbox and the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. And feel free to drop a link for federal jobs guarantee. If there are additional info that you want people to know, drop it in the chat, please. Let's turn to Jess. Jess with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Care in Action. Want to hear from you about universal family care.
Yes, thank you so much, Solana, for all the work that you have done to get us to this panel. And to my fellow panelists, it's really exciting to see all these ideas together. It's like the Voltron of the new economy, and it's so low key. It's what if we changed literally everything? Also, it's very possible. Really? Let's do it today. Okay. I love it. It makes me so excited. I need more excitement in these times. Good excitement, not anxiety excitement, maybe is the way to say it. And actually, speaking of that, for us, the way that we think about this is as a moment of transformation, this moment in time, but also in our economy. One of the places where it's the most deeply needed, but also urgently needed, there really is not more time to waste, is how we care for the people we love at every stage of our life. I think this is especially sort of prescient in these COVID times where, we just collided with our care infrastructure in a way that people didn't even realize was going to happen. And that, in fact, actually, that people have been predicting was going to happen in the near future. And by near future, I literally mean by 2030, and it just got sped up completely to the last 6 months and in the foreseeable future. And I think we're about to be in kind of almost phase 2 of that as people think about going back to school and families are trying to figure out what to do in this back to school place. So the pandemic has really exposed what families have really known for a very long time, which is that caregivers need more support and care workers need working conditions that actually reflect their values. at the very least, that means higher pay, critical benefits, and basic protections. And there are all kinds of caregivers. So there's caregivers that are similar to what I represent, domestic workers who work in the kind of like more formal, informal economy of domestic work. And then there are also even more informally family caregivers who provide support for, the aunt who stays and takes care of grandma, or grandma who takes care of your kids. So that obviously is a really complicated ecosystem. None of those people are really part of the formal economy, but as I'm sure many of you know, it costs families and it costs individuals to provide that kind of care. And what we kind of seen is the way we thought about care before is that it's like a go it alone approach. And that's actually made it basically impossible for families to sustain care, especially Black and brown families. What we're talking about with universal family care is a complete change in that approach. And instead of seeing care as an individual level responsibility for each family to figure out, we would see care as a collective responsibility in our society that, frankly, this government-sized problem needs a government-sized intervention, which it just does not have right now. Not only for the moment that we're in, but also for the moment that we'll be in the future, because caregiving and the care economy are exploding right now and over the next 10 or 15 years. So this is about to be a huge sector of our economy that we are not, when I say we're using like outdated modes, I don't just mean we're using like, from the early 20th century. I mean, we're still using modes that existed like in the 19th century, like truly that's kind of the basis of a lot of this. So there's no way that this is going to support us into the 21st century or like the 22nd century, if there even is a 22nd century. So this is a really, really big change. And not only this, what we're looking for in universal family care is really navigating the intersection of public health and economic crisis. How do we figure out how to make it possible for all of us to have childcare, all of us to have long-term care and paid leave, which is really, that's the support we need to care for ourselves and our loved ones from the cradle to the grave. And making sure that care jobs are good jobs, because as I said, this is an explosive part of the economy. So what we're looking at right now, just to like really lay it out, is the jobs of the future are poverty wage jobs. So this, kind of overlays with this housing, it overlays with the jobs guarantee, all that stuff, because we need to make sure that these are good jobs that people will have, as well as making sure that people have the care they need. So this is like both sides of the economy, both a consumer and a worker problem. Okay, I'm getting excited, so I'll stop there. More to come.
That's fantastic, Jess. And what I love is actually that you remind us that while these ideas are, pretty, they're not new to us, the idea of putting them all together is critical. And it's part of why we're having this conversation. So we shouldn't take for granted that, we're just trying to change the economy all at once. But we're actually saying like that's what's necessary right now. I want to turn to Mia Birdsong, fellow with the Economic Security Project, and More Than Enough podcast host. I want you to talk about basic income, please.
Part of what I think about in this moment is we're thinking about like we need to ask for all of these things. We need to demand all of these things, not just one of them. Is that, if you had asked me a year ago, would guaranteed income be something that was being thought of seriously right now? Like I would have laughed at you. So I think we often underestimate how powerful and necessary these ideas are. I mean, not the people on this panel, obviously, but the public. And I think we need to be much bolder. And I mean, we're talking about basic human rights, so it's not actually that bold. Like the bar is very low. So one of the things there are many things that I love about guaranteed income. One of the things that it does is it creates a floor below which no one will fall, right? If we have guaranteed income, it doesn't matter if you are employed or not. It doesn't matter if you have inherited wealth or not. You can be in between all kinds of things. If we have guaranteed income, it means that you have a cushion that helps you transition through all these different parts of your life. The other thing is that cash in the context of capitalism creates a space for people to make choices. It allows for a certain kind of freedom and agency. What we've seen from decades of guaranteed income pilots and from kind of equivalent work is that when each of us knows what we need to do in our own lives to make us happy, to move ourselves forward. The government can't decide that. A program can't decide that. Cash inside of the context of capitalism allows us to be flexible with what we need. So what I might prioritize might be my kids' education, or fixing my car. It may be dealing with emergencies. It may be doing things that are about investing in ways that I'm going to move my life forward. But that's going to be different for each of us. And cash allows us to make those choices. And when it comes to people of color, there is no one policy that is going to kind of create the tremendous equity and justice that we really need when it comes to income and wealth and the economy in America. But these things are all part of a piece of the puzzle that's really important. Historically, Black people in particular, but people of color in general, have been excluded from labor laws and worker protections. Black people have been pushed into low-wage jobs and kept from achieving employment. Poor people, largely people of color, have been targeted for economic extraction, like if you think about subprime mortgages. And there's been this intentional creation and maintenance of economic instability and insecurity. And guaranteed income, along with many of these other policies we're talking about, help us decrease the distance between, Black households, Indigenous households, and Latinx households that have like 10% of the wealth of the median white household, and particularly when it comes to women, that is even more dramatic. So this is part of none of these things are going to solve for the racism in our economy, but they're all going to kind of together help us get to where we need to go. And I think that, as I think about the question of agency, especially right now when our unemployment is so high and the veil has been pulled back on so many of the things that many people have been struggling with for a long time. I'm encouraged by what I've seen from families in Jackson, Mississippi, and in Stockton, where there are 2 guaranteed income pilots going on right now, and the stories that people are telling about not just the difference it makes for people in terms of the economic experience they have, like what they're able to pay for, what they're able to avoid. But there is a psychological breathing room that gets created when people have access to money they didn't have before, when people have a little bit more choice and agency in their lives. And that, what that does for people's quality of life, I don't think is something we can overestimate.
Thank you, Mia. You mentioned the pilots that are happening, and we're talking about economic rights here, and we are seeing some early advances. And folks usually ask, well, has it been done before? Do we know that it'll really work? What do the pilots tell us? So I'm gonna turn to you to maybe share some more about what are we seeing? And I'll ask Jess the same question,
Yes.
But let's go to you first, Mia.
Here's what I want to say about pilots. When it comes to all of this, when it comes to care, when it comes to housing, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to income, we all know what it means for people to have housing. We don't need evidence for what it means. Like, I have a home. I know what that means for me. We know what it means for people to have jobs. We know what it means for people to be able to afford to have childcare or elder care or care for people with disabilities. We know what it means when people have the income that they need to live. So part of what we need to, what's in your question is that all these things that we're talking about are things that help us achieve basic human rights, and we do not need to pilot those things. The only reason that we should be piloting basic human rights is as a movement strategy. We do not need to build evidence for those things. And when we behave as if we do need to build evidence, then we give credence to the idea that people who do not have these things, so poor people and disproportionately people of color, that we need to somehow prove that they should deserve these things, or that they're going to do something good with them, right? They're going to do something moral or correct with them. That said, from the pilots that we have running right now in Stockton and in Jackson, Mississippi, and we've had like 40 years of pilots for guaranteed income. And what we see, unsurprisingly, is that people spend their money on all the things that we would expect them to spend money on. They spend money on housing, they spend money on education, they spend money on savings, they spend money on healthcare, they pay off debt, they invest in their children. They do the things that all of us do when we have money. They go on vacation. And some of the conversations that I had with folks, I did this project where I traveled across the country and I talked to poor people about guaranteed income and kind of what it would mean for them to not have to worry about having money in their lives. And people said they'd be able to, allow their kid who tried out for the football team to actually join the football team because they could pay for the uniform. They wouldn't have to make the choice between keeping the gas on in their house and putting gas in their car to get to work. They would go on vacation, by which they meant drive like a state over to visit their family who they haven't seen in a decade, who had never met their children. So really just like normal ass human shit is what people do with money. And we know that. And we know that part of what happens when after people are able to take care of their own needs is that they start to take care of each other. So you see an increase in people helping out their neighbors. You see an increase in civic engagement. You see an increase in people, they don't have to look inward so much because they're worried about like, am I going to be able to put food on the table today? And they're able to turn their vision outward toward the people who are in their lives, like in their immediate communities, and toward the greater world. So that's what happens when people have enough money.
Yeah, pretty basic, right? Like, when people don't have cash and you give them cash.
Let me just add one more thing.
Yeah.
The things that we're talking about, these basic human rights, we do pilots in part to demonstrate that like people are going to do like smart and responsible things with their resources, right? But the fact is, human rights are not things that you have to demonstrate that you deserve to have. They're just rights. So a 58-year-old who spends his day smoking pot and playing video games in his mother's basement also deserves housing, also deserves access to a job, also deserves care, also deserves a basic income. So we don't need to prove that people need these things. They just do. And we need to stop positioning ourselves in a position to prove that people are going to make smart decisions with things that are rights.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And I want to turn to Jess because I know that universal family care is making headway at the federal level, but a big part of your strategy has been that like states don't have to wait for the federal government. Want to hear more about your strategy there.
Yeah, I do need to talk about the federal just for a second, only because we did have a big thing that happened basically 2 weeks ago, which was like a significant, like just truly has like literally never happened before, which is that Joe Biden released his care economy kind of like agenda. So two important things happened. One is a huge part of a potential Biden administration for economic recovery is really focused around care. And that is like, I'm like not a Joe Biden apologist, and that's literally never happened in our country's history. So that's a really big embrace that is important and really signals that like he and people around him like understand that this is like a urgent and also future, near and far future problem. So like really, we're very excited about that. It's a good plan. It would give $775 billion over 10 years, which is more by a lot than has been invested in care in kind of like any way before. Now, it does not, so like, woohoo, Hosanna, fire up, celebration. And that does not get us all the way there. It is not a guarantee. It's not universal family care, which I think is really important. One of the things that kind of underpins a lot of how we think about family care is kind of research that our executive director, visionary thinker, Ai-jen Poo has done around what she calls the sandwich generation. So people are having kids later and living longer. And I bring that up here to say part of what we're facing here is that these are actually new challenges we have that we've never had before, that are based on other, you know, amazing things that are happening in the world. People are living longer because they're getting healthier, and, you know, people are able to make choices about how they want to live their lives and not just like have kids immediately. Like these are great things. So part of this is also, as we build out all of these kind of new and visionary ways of thinking, we also have to kind of think about what are the consequences to other parts of our world and our economy, as opposed to just like building, you know, frankly, like super capitalist things that like make one part of something better without thinking about everything else. So I say that because that's a part of what states are also needing to grapple with as they think about how to build out these kind of like state specific things. And state strategy is really important in the context of care, because the type of care that is needed or is most urgent in the state is really dependent on what that state's makeup looks like. For instance, in a state like, let's say, Maine, one of the oldest states in the union, maybe the oldest state in the union, they really need to get focused on long-term care, which is really focused around elders. We've had big success in Hawaii and Washington, and in those places they've been thinking both about elder and also family, like childcare as well, because they were seeing families who were kind of in that in-between crunch. And like we have also seen, like when we've had pilots, they've gone really well. It's really clear people don't have enough money. They need more money. Like, it's just, I don't know, it's a little bit hard for me to like take seriously this idea, because it's just like, well, it turns out when they looked, there was this much money in the bank account. It cost this much for a caregiver to come every day for grandma, and it costs this much for like a nanny to come. And then when you added those two numbers together, those numbers did not match up for how much money they had in their bank account. And so when they got more money, they were able to get more care. People were healthier and lived longer and had better experiences. And I know that sounds like, one thing I think is a little bit challenging, this is where people's individual experiences, which they're very much feeling in the context of care, and then like our government are kind of like lining up, which is that the government thinks about that as like a different bank account, right? Because Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and childcare and paid family leave, all those things get paid out of different government agencies, different government bank accounts. Now, it's not like our bank account, it's trillions of dollars, but it is still sort of like, and it's mostly still a way like about different ones. So when people are asking for pilots, they're asking to be able to say, can our bank account handle this? And those bank accounts are not like one giant shared B of A, you know, it's like, they're very, very different. Now, when we talk about them with our individual family level, it's only one bank account. It's only one bank account. It doesn't even have close to trillions of dollars. So I think that's where there's sometimes a mismatch between where governments are thinking about it and where families are thinking about it. Because for families, there's no additional money, there's no additional bank account. They got to figure it out. It may be the closest thing I could think of is like your collective extended family bank account with auntie and uncle and grandma and grandpa and everybody in there. But again, still small. The numbers still don't add up. And it's why I think that this moment with family care is so important, because what we're seeing with COVID is that when people were faced with choices around, should we take care of mom and dad, or should we take care of our kids, or should we take care of ourselves? What do we do about this? Like, collision is the only word that I can just sort of like think of, because then people really had to they were already making really hard economic choices. Now we're making choices about literally life or death, right? Can we afford, we're losing our jobs, first of all. So how do we pay for a caregiver who's coming? But then what are we supposed to do about this caregiver? Are they on the subway? How many people are they being exposed to? What is that caregiver supposed to do with her children, which are at home? And we've heard over and over again from caregivers who have told us things like, I had to go see my client. I'm the only person who interacts with my client. I'm worried my client will die if I do not go to their house. And that was already true beforehand, but now it's really true during the COVID times. I'm worried they will contract COVID and literally no one will know. And to do that, I had to leave my child at home because daycare closed. And so they've been alone for 8 hours a day. Like, this is a common story with the workers that we work with. And that's honestly a better case scenario than some other people who have no care. And so you have elders who, and that's in a non-nursing home context. That's an individual to individual context. So it's even, so believe it or not, that's more safe than some of the other options that people are having to do. So this is like all around at state and local level, we're seeing just a complete need to not just, like, we are interested in pilots, we are interested in working with states, we are working with states, but this is like a next 10 months problem that we need to solve, in addition to the 2030 economy problem that we need to solve. Like what happened, like when you asked me to do this panel, this is a totally different answer than I would have you given 6 months ago when Netroots things are due, because we're just in a completely different economic context. And it also means that some of these projections that we have for what's going to happen and what challenges we have, those projections have been just completely flown out the window. We don't know how long COVID is going to last. And so every day that we don't have any kind of answer for this is literally every single day that people's economic prospects for generations are being hurt.
Yeah, I think what you're bringing up is so important. And I often think about these conversations, even during the primaries, right, where there was all these radical ideas, and now they're practical because of the pandemic, and we have to do them. And what I'm hoping is that there's actually a new window and a new gateway into thinking about these big ideas. Sarah, I wasn't sure if you wanted to weigh in on this question as well, about pilots, about testing. What do we need to know?
Yeah, thank you. This is Sarah, and I just want to say I think that it is about the difference in the moment. So around a job guarantee, I think it is important to point out it must be federally funded. You could potentially pilot it at a very small scale, but the cost of it is prohibitive at the state and local level, even though I know that there's some interest. So it needs to be federally funded. There is bicameral legislation that has been introduced for a job guarantee pilot in 15 communities. Another version was around 5 communities. And I would support it. And it would be so woefully inadequate at this moment, right? So that was introduced before this crisis. Now we have 30 million people on unemployment, 1 in 5 workers. That's an undercount of the true unemployed, right? And then of course, low wage workers. So just I think that by definition, right, a pilot is exclusive, and that's incredibly painful when you're talking about these things that every person needs. So I would just encourage progressives listening to this at this conference to consider that and to go for the actual job guarantee that is the need that we have. That's a full-blown guarantee and not just a pilot. While I'd be happy to see a pilot, but it'd be inadequate.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So we touched a little bit upon this, about the frequently asked questions that we get. I know when I talk about, we want everything, not one thing, not 2 things, the whole thing, the whole menu. I often get, well, how do we pay for that? And we can't possibly do all these things. I'm going to turn to Tara. Do you get these kinds of questions about how would we ever pay for millions of new units of social housing? Or could we ever possibly bring our existing public housing up to a livable standard? How do you respond to those kinds of questions?
Well, first, I take a deep breath and I try to keep my eyeballs in my head because they're rolling so far that sometimes I lose track of them. And then, the reality is we can pay for it. We must pay for it. It's not even a question that I like to entertain that much, not because I think it's a small one. Obviously, it's a big one, and implementing these types of policies is as important as imagining them. So ultimately, we're going to have to answer that question somehow. But I think it's important that we root our understanding and how we pay for these types of visionary policies in the reality that we do not ask these questions about other policies. And I think in housing, there are so many examples of policies that have been implemented over the years that have disproportionately benefited white people, that have cost our government so much money and continue to cost our government so much money. And we have never once asked the question, how are we going to pay for it? Why do we need to pay for this thing? What's going to be the cost benefit of this investment? And one of my favorite examples is with public housing, actually. By, again, a very successful conspiracy of the profiteers, public housing has become this highly stigmatized thing in American society. But actually, when it was first built, it was built to recover the economy, to stimulate jobs, to put people back to work, and to house disproportionately white working class people. And when it was built for those white folks, it was a decent place to live. Trust me, I know the people who grew up in that public housing, right? They're still alive today, and they'll tell you it was a decent place to live. And their parents were workers who benefited hugely from that public investment. And then our government made a massive investment in moving those white families to the suburbs and subsidizing their mortgages so that they could buy the single family home with the white picket fence and live their American dream, and then left public housing in a state of complete and total American nightmare. And when Black and brown people moved into public housing is exactly the moment when public housing was disinvested from, was neglected for the rest of time. And then in the most horrific twist of all, that was blamed on the victims, right? That was blamed on the residents of public housing. And they were told that they were the problem. They are still being told that they are the problem. Meanwhile, we have taken all of the money out of that system. And then even today, right, we sit in 2020 in an America where we all just paid our taxes. And in the tax system that exists today, there's the mortgage interest deduction. That means that homeowners can get a write-off on their mortgages for their first and their second home that costs the government $80 billion, which, by the way, is double the HUD budget. We don't ask these questions when the policies benefit white people. Right? We only ask the questions when the policies stand to benefit people of color and the people who have been excluded from our economy, who have been extracted from, right? Right now, I'm on vacation for the viewers out there. And so I've been doing a lot of reading, and I'm reading this book, an amazing book by Bell Hooks called All About Love. And in this book, Bell Hooks writes about the ethic of power and domination versus the ethic of love. And the ethic of power and domination is the ethic that prevails in our economy today. And it's the ethic that says that someone can be the lord of the land, and that person gets to lord over the people who rent from them on that land. That's an ethic of power and domination. An ethic of love doesn't even ask the question, how much does it cost for people to have homes? An ethic of love just says people need homes. To Mia's point from before, we don't need to pilot this. We don't need to measure outcomes. We know that people need homes. An ethic of love is an ethic that guarantees those homes to people. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say.
I love it. I love bell hooks. I love ethic. And other folks, I think part of the reason why we wanted to do this panel was to also demonstrate that there is no need to pit these issues against one another. That, unlike the earned income tax credit, we don't need to say, well, should we do increasing minimum wage? Because we already have this earned income tax credit over here. Do we need to do both? Yes. The answer for us is we need to do all of these things and more. Other panelists, we have just a few minutes. What do you say to questions or pushback or other pushback that you get that you want to share?
I mean, I just want to say it's going to be expensive. I think sometimes we try to pretend it's going to be cheap. It's not going to be cheap. It just isn't. It's going to be expensive. So that's the first thing. You're just looking here, what costs. Oh, I mean, it says there's a heavy, heavy price tag. But part of that price tag is there's a couple of things. One is we need more money because these are new problems that we've never faced before, that we're kind of let me rephrase. We have these problems, but we're facing them in new ways, and that will only continue. So that's one. And that's why there's just more funding is needed because new problems are surfacing. Two is pieces of this we will take away from other parts of the federal budget to go into here. So one great example of this is long-term care is one of the biggest pieces of universal family care, and it's one of the most underfunded pieces in the federal government, but it's one of our biggest problems we have right now. And one of the biggest changes that will happen under universal family care is we'll move away from the home. We'll keep people in their homes as they grow older, which the vast majority of people prefer is staying in their homes instead of going to like an old folks home. That system of supporting elderly people to live in a communal home costs the federal government and state governments tons of money. As we take away from those systems, which the vast majority of people do not prefer, we will put them into individuals staying in their home, which is actually cheaper and more preferable. So that's like one big way that stuff will change. But there's other ways it will change, because this also, like, the idea of thinking about care holistically, about childcare, about paid family leave, is there are other pieces of this that, while expensive, will also help different parts of keeping people safe throughout their life, keeping people cared for throughout their life, keeping people healthier throughout their life, that will have other changes in the economy. So I want to be totally real. It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's looking at people's health in a way that is much more holistic, that supports them, and will ultimately cost the federal government in different ways that I think are frankly preferable to the American public.
I just want to add, yes, this is going to cost a ton of money. And I think part of what happens, and this is why we end up being like, well, do we want to do this one thing or this other one thing, is that we think about like the current federal budget as some pie that we're just going to have to like slice up in different ways. But the fact is that we can actually increase the size of the pie, or we can make multiple pies. We can make a whole fucking bakery full of pies by changing the current wealth redistribution that we have in this country, because we currently have wealth redistribution in this country. And what happens is the top 0.1% of the population are hoarding that wealth. All of the income that's being generated is being redistributed to them. And we need to properly distribute it by making sure that like people who have jobs can actually like pay for shit, but also by taxing the hell out of billionaires and multimillionaires. Those people nobody should have $1 billion. So it's not just that we need to like look at our federal budget and figure out like, what are we going to let's get rid of, we're going to cut the military budget and we're going to spend it on this. Yes, we're going to do that. But we also are going to like actually put more money into the pie so that we actually can pay for all of these things. And these are things that we all deserve. And ultimately, yes, some people are going to have to give some things up. Maybe somebody will not have a private island or multiple corporate jets or 5 homes.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm really glad you said that, because it's also like part of what we're doing is people who can afford it, because what we're taking away from them is a private jet. Like literally that's the thing, right? Versus what is happening right now, which is families cannot afford it. And what we're taking away from them is literally like putting gas in the car or not, right? Dying with hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical debt. Exactly. Grandma getting to eat, like that's the thing that I think is to me, we should live in a society that does that. But not only that, like that's just also like smart economics, just period. It just like actually is both moral and makes the most sense.
Totally.
Like I just don't know how else to say that.
I want to thank each of you. We're right nearly at time. Mia Birdsong, Tara Raghuveer, Jess Morales Roqueto, Sarah Truhaft. This has been a fantastic panel for me, just because I have so much more hope that you all are in this fight with me and many others. I love this idea that that rights are automatic. We should not have any deservedness criteria that goes out of the window. We do not need to pilot a right. I think Sarah mentioned this. We don't have to pilot an economic right. We don't need to, we can't. That we live in abundance. And that we know what works because we've done it for white folks and we've done it for wealthy people over and over again. So I think if anything you're taking away from this is to think big, think about this next economy as one where everyone belongs and that we all have these basic economic rights. And with that, I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you to the audience, and we'll see you in a better economy.
Thank you so much, Solana.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Alana. You all are amazing. Take care.
Thank you all.
Yes. Enjoy your vacation.
Yeah, right. Go back to vacation.